Hello, this is Morel with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. Last words were that in time my eyes gradually shut up, and from seeming to hear the clergyman singing a drowsy song in the heat, I hear nothing, until I fall off the seat with a crash, and am taken out more dead than alive by Peggotty. All right, okay, so let me continue. And by the way, before I do, please subscribe to the channel. Please subscribe and please share. And now, I see the outside of our house with the lattice bedroom windows standing open to let in the sweet-smelling air, and the ragged old rook's nest still dangling in the elm trees at the bottom of the front garden. Now I'm in the garden at the back, beyond the yard where the empty pigeon house and dog kennel are, a very preserve of butterflies, as I remember it, with a high fence and a gate and padlock, where the fruit clusters on the trees, riper and richer than fruit has ever been since in any other garden, and where my mother gathers some in a basket, while I stand by, bolting furtive gooseberries and trying to look unmoved. A great wind rises, and the summer is gone in a moment. We are playing in the winter twilight, dancing about the parlour, when my mother is out of breath and rests herself in an elbow chair. I watch her, winding her bright curls round her fingers and straightening her waist. And nobody knows better than I do that she likes to look so well and is proud of being so pretty. That is among my very earliest impressions. That, and a sense that we were both a little afraid of Peggotty, and submitted ourselves in most things to her direction, were among the first opinions, if they may be so called, that I ever derived from what I saw. Peggotty and I were sitting one night by the parlour fire alone. I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles. I must have read very perspicuously, or the poor soul must have been deeply interested, for I remember she had a cloudy impression after I had done, that they were a sort of vegetable. I was tired of reading and dead sleepy, but having leave as a high treat to sit up until my mother came home from spending the evening at a neighbour's, I would rather have died upon my post, of course, than have gone to bed. I had reached that stage of sleepiness when Peggotty seemed to swell and grow immensely large. I propped my eyelids open with my 2 forefingers and looked perseveringly at her as she sat at work, at the little bit of wax candle she kept for her thread. How old it looked, being so wrinkled in all directions. At the little house with a thatched roof where the yard measure lived, had her workbox with a sliding lid, with a view of St. Paul's Cathedral, with a pink dome painted on the top. At the brass thimble on her finger, at herself, whom I thought lovely. I felt so sleepy that I knew if I lost sight of anything for a moment, I was gone. "Peggotty," says I suddenly, "were you ever married?" "Oh, Lord, Master Davy," replied Peggotty, "what's put marriage in your head?" She answered with such a start that it quite awoke me. And then she stopped in her work and looked at me with her needle drawn out to its thread's length. "But were you ever married, Peggotty?" says I. "You are a very handsome woman, ain't you?" I thought her in a different style from my mother, certainly, but of another school of beauty. I considered her a perfect example. There was a red velvet footstool in the best parlour, on which my mother had painted a nosegay. The groundwork of that stool and Peggotty's complexion appeared to me to be one and the same thing. The stool was smooth and Peggotty was rough, but that made no difference. "Me? Handsome, Davy?" said Peggotty. "Lord, no, my dear. But what put marriage in your head?" "I don't know. You mustn't marry more than one person at a time, may you, Peggotty?" "Certainly not," said Peggotty with the promptest decision. "But if you marry a person and the person dies, why then you may marry another person, mayn't you, Peggotty?" "You may," says Peggotty, "if you choose, my dear. That's a matter of opinion." "But what is your opinion, Peggotty?" said I. I asked her, and looked curiously at her, because she looked so curiously at me. "My opinion is," said Peggotty, taking her eyes from me after a little indecision and going on with her work, "that I never was married myself, Master Davy, and that I don't expect to be. That's all I know about the subject." "You ain't cross, I suppose, Peggotty, are you?" said I, after sitting quiet for a moment. I really thought she was. She had been so short with me. But I was quite mistaken, for she laid aside her work, which was a stocking of her own, and opening her arms wide, took my curly head within them and gave it a good squeeze. I know it was a good squeeze because, being very plump, whenever she made any little excursion about after she was dressed, some of the buttons on the back of her gown flew off. And I recollect she burst in to the opposite side of the parlour while she was hugging me. "Now, let me hear some more about the crocodiles," said Peggotty, who was not quite right in the name yet, for I ain't heard half enough. I couldn't quite understand why Peggotty looked so queer, or why she was so ready to go back to the crocodiles. However, we returned to those monsters with fresh wakefulness on my part, and we left their eggs in the sand for the sun to hatch, and we ran away from them and baffled them by constantly turning, which they were unable to do quickly, on account of their unwieldy make. And we went into the water after them as natives and put sharp pieces of timber down their throats. And in short, we ran the whole crocodile gauntlet. I did, at least. But I had my doubts of Peggotty, who was thoughtfully sticking her needle into various parts of her face and arms all the time. We had exhausted the crocodiles and begun with the alligators when the garden bell rang. We went out to the door, and there was my mother, looking unusually pretty, I thought, and with her a gentleman with beautiful black hair and whiskers who had walked home with us from church last Sunday. As my mother stooped down on the threshold to take me in her arms and kiss me, the gentleman said, I was a more highly privileged little fellow than a monarch, or something like that, but my later understanding comes. I am sensible to my aid here. What does that mean? I asked him over her shoulder. He patted me on the head, but somehow I didn't like him or his deep voice, and I was jealous that his hand should touch my mother's in touching me, which it did. I put it away as well as I could. Oh, Davy, remonstrated my mother. Dear boy, said the gentleman, I cannot wonder at his devotion. I never saw such a beautiful colour on my mother's face before. She gently chid me from being rude, and keeping me close to her shawl, turned to thank the gentleman for taking so much trouble as to bring her home. She put out her hand to him as she spoke, and as he met it with his own, she glanced, I thought, at me. Let us say good night, my fine boy, said the gentleman, when he had bent his head. I saw him over my mother's little glove. Good night, said I. Come, let us be the best friends in the world, said the gentleman, laughing. Shake hands. My right hand was in my mother's left, so I gave him the other. Why, that's the wrong hand, Davy, laughed the gentleman. My mother drew my right hand forward, but I was resolved for my former reason not to give it him, and I did not. I gave him the other, and he shook it heartily, and said I was a brave fellow, and went away. At this minute I see him turn round in the garden, and give us a last look with his ill-omened black eyes before the door was shut. Peggotty, who had not said a word or moved a finger, secured the fastening instantly, and we all went into the parlour. My mother, contrary to her usual habit, instead of coming to the elbow chair by the fire, remained at the other end of the room, and sat singing to herself. Hope you have had a pleasant evening, ma'am, said Peggotty, standing as stiff as a barrel in the centre of the room, with a candlestick in her hand. Oh, much obliged to you, Peggotty, returned my mother in a cheerful voice. I have had a very pleasant evening. A stranger also makes an agreeable change, suggested Peggotty. A very agreeable change indeed, returned my mother. Peggotty continuing to stand motionless in the middle of the room, and my mother resuming her singing. I fell asleep, though I was not so sound asleep but that I could hear voices, without hearing what they said. When I half awoke from this uncomfortable doze, I found Peggotty and my mother both in tears, and both talking. Not such a one as this Mr. Copperfield wouldn't have liked, said Peggotty. That I say, and that I swear. Good heavens, cried my mother, you'll drive me mad. Was ever any poor girl so ill-used by her servants as I am? Why do I do myself the injustice of calling myself a girl? Have I never been married, Peggotty? God knows you have, ma'am, returned Peggotty. Then how can you dare, said my mother. You know I don't mean, how can you dare, Peggotty, but how can you have the heart to make me so uncomfortable and say such bitter things to me when you are aware that I haven't, out of this place, a single friend to turn to? The more's the reason, returned Peggotty, for saying that it won't do. No, that it won't do, no. No price could make it do, no. I thought Peggotty would have thrown the candlestick away. She was so emphatic with it. "How can you be so aggravated?" said my mother, shedding more tears than before, so as to talk in such an unjust manner. "How can you go on as if it was all settled and arranged? Peggotty, when I tell you over and over again, you cruel thing, that beyond the commonest civilities, nothing has passed. You talk of admiration. What am I to do? If people are so silly as to indulge the sentiment, is it my fault? What am I to do, I ask you? Would you wish me to shave my head and black my face, or disfigure myself with a burn or a scald, or something of that sort? I dare say you would, Peggotty. I dare say you'd quite enjoy it." Peggotty seemed to take this aspersion very much to heart, I thought. "And my dear boy," cried my mother, coming to the elbow chair in which I was, and caressing me, "my own little Davy, is it to be hinted to me that I am wanting in affection for my precious treasure, the dearest little fellow that ever was? Nobody never went and hinted no such a thing," said Peggotty. "You did, Peggotty," returned my mother. "You know you did. What else was it impossible to infer from what you said, you unkind creature, when you know as well as I do that on his account only last quarter I wouldn't buy myself a new parasol, though that old green one is frayed the whole way up, and the fringe is perfectly mangy. You know it is, Peggotty. You can't deny it." Then turning affectionately to me, with her cheek against mine, "Am I a naughty mamma, do you say so, baby? Am I a nasty, cruel, selfish, bad mamma? Say I am, my child. Say yes, dear boy, and Peggotty will love you. And Peggotty's love is a great deal better than mine. Davy, I don't love you at all, do I?" At this, we all fell a-crying together. I think I was the loudest of the party, but I'm sure we were all sincere about it. I was quite heartbroken myself, and am afraid that in the first transport of wounded tenderness, I called Peggotty a beast. That honest creature was in deep affliction, I remember, and must have become quite buttonless on the occasion, for a little volley of those explosive went off, when after having made it up with my mother, she kneeled down by the elbow chair and made it up with me. We went to bed, greatly dejected. My sobs kept waking me for a long time, and when one very strong sob quite hoisted me up in bed, I found my mother sitting on the coverlet and leaning over me. I fell asleep in her arms after that, and slept soundly. Whether it was the following Sunday when I saw the gentleman again, or whether there was any greater lapse of time before he reappeared, I cannot recall. I don't profess to be clear about dates, but there he was in church, and he walked home with us afterwards. He came in to look at a famous geranium we had in the parlour window. It did not appear to me that he took much notice of it, but before he went he asked my mother to give him a bit of the blossom. She begged him to choose it for himself, but he refused to do that. I could not understand why. So she plucked it for him and gave it into his hand. He said he would never part with it any more, and I thought he must be quite a fool not to know that it would fall to pieces in a day or two. Peggotty began to be less with us, of an evening than she had always been. My mother deferred to her very much more than usual. It occurred to me, and we were all three excellent friends. Still we were different from what we used to be, and were not so comfortable among ourselves. Sometimes I fancied that Peggotty perhaps objected to my mother's wearing all the pretty dresses she had in her drawers, or to her going so often to visit that neighbour's. But I couldn't, to my satisfaction, make out how it was. Gradually, I became used to seeing the gentleman with the black whiskers. I liked him no better than at first, and had the same uneasy jealousy of him. But if I had any reason for it beyond a child's instinctive dislike, and a general idea that Peggotty and I could make much of my mother without any help, it certainly was not the reason that I might have found if I had been older. No such thing came into my mind, or near it. I could observe in little pieces, as it were, but as to making a net of a number of these pieces and catching anybody in it, that was as yet beyond me. One autumn morning, I was with my mother in the front garden, when Mr. Murdstone, I knew him by that name now, came by on horseback. He reined up his horse to salute my mother, and said he was going to Lowestoft to see some friends who were there with a yacht, and merrily proposed to take me on the saddle before him if I would like the ride. The air was so clear and pleasant, and the horse seemed to like the idea of the ride so much himself, as he stood snorting and pawing at the garden gate, that I had a great desire to go. So I was sent upstairs to Peggotty to be made spruce, and in the meantime Mr. Murdstone dismounted, and with his horse's bridle drawn over his arm, walked slowly up and down on the outer side of the sweet briar fence, while my mother walked slowly up and down on the inner to keep him company. I recollect Peggotty and I peeping out at them from my little window. I recollect how closely they seemed to be examining the sweet briar between them as they strolled along, and how, from being in a perfectly angelic temper, Peggotty turned cross in a moment and brushed my hair the wrong way excessively hard. Mr. Murdstone and I were soon off, and trotting along on the green turf by the side of the road. He held me quite easily with one arm, and I don't think I was restless usually, but I could not make up my mind to sit in front of him without turning my head sometimes and looking up in his face. He had that kind of shallow black eye. I want a better word to express an eye that has no depth in it to be looked into, which, when it is abstracted, seems, from some peculiarity of light, to be disfigured, for a moment at a time, by a cast. Several times when I glanced at him, I observed that appearance with a sort of awe, and wondered what he was thinking about so closely. His hair and whiskers were blacker and thicker, looked at so near, than even I had given them credit for being. A squareness about the lower part of his face, and the dotted indication of the strong black beard he shaved close every day, reminded me of the waxwork that had travelled into our neighbourhood some half a year before. This, his regular eyebrows, and the rich white and black and brown of his complexion, confound his complexion and his memory, made me think him, in spite of my misgiving, a very handsome man. I have no doubt that my poor dear mother thought him so too. Join me for the next episode, the next video of David Copperfield. Join me for the next video of David Copperfield. Look forward to the next video. Bye.